Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Almost a year ago, I, 24M, was fresh out of college and had just moved into an apartment with my middle school best friend, 23F, and her fiancé, 25M. This was after a long period of not seeing her in person. My best friend and I had a long and great relationship with few rocky periods. I didn't know her fiancé well, but had met him a couple of times. He came off as kind of rude and loud, but mostly nice enough. I let a lot of little annoying behavior slide because she was so in love with him. I really just wanted to spend time with my best friend. Over the course of a few months, I slowly discovered that she was trapped in an abusive relationship with the most classic example of a malignant narcissist imaginable. Their fights, really just him raging at her while she cried, escalated to the point where he was completely trashing the apartment, breaking her phone and laptop, hiding her car keys, blocking the door, and grabbing her arms so hard she had bruises, all while hurling out the worst insults he could fathom at the top of his lungs for hours. This man was about a foot taller and 100 pounds heavier than me, so there was nothing I could do other than give her rides somewhere else to stay until the next day. He didn't like it when I did that. Once it reached the point of physical harm against her, I put my foot down and demanded that he move out, or I would call the cops. He wasn't technically signed onto the lease, so I could have him kicked out. He begged for time to find a new place. He had been under the influence of substances the night he hurt her, and he promised to stay sober until he moved. Not wanting to escalate things, I agreed on the condition that nothing like that ever happen again. My friend and her fiancé broke up soon after that. 3 weeks passed, and everything was going great. The ex-fiancé had found a new place and was in training for a new job. While still loud and inconsiderate, he hadn't caused any problems so far. I got ready for bed early since I had an important meeting at 8:00 a.m. I put on some comfy pajamas, locking my door before I changed out of habit. My best friend was out working, and it was just me upstairs in bed and the ex-fiancé downstairs, yelling on the phone about something. I tuned him out and tried to sleep. My chest jolted from the booming footfalls up the stairs to my room, waking me from sleep. My eyes snapped open to see my bedroom doorknob rattling back and forth. Locked. He let out a yell of pure malice and banged on my door. He screamed my name, and it was so slurred he sounded like he was trying to impersonate a lizard man. The hinges weren't looking so good. We lived in a cheap apartment with thin doors. I had to do something before he broke open the door. "What the heck?" I said. It was the only thing I could think of. Suddenly, the banging and screaming stopped. My doorknob fell still. After a terrifying moment of silence, he said flatly, "Open the door, bud. Just come and open the door." I still laugh about that one, like, after all that, I'd just walk over and open up. Instead, I grabbed my essentials and jumped out the window. I was on the second floor, but we lived on a hill, so the fall wasn't quite that high. I still managed to fall wrong. I hobbled as quickly as I could to my car and peeled away. I called my best friend and warned her not to go home. We made plans for her to stay with a friend after she got off work. I made it to the friend's house and passed out for a few hours. I woke up to a call from my best friend. The ex-fiancé had traveled all the way to her workplace with a knife and broke in. He assaulted her and held the knife up to her special needs client's throat, threatening to kill him in front of her. Thank God a coworker overheard everything in another room and was able to call the police in time for everyone to come out alive. My best friend also said he was on the phone with her while he was banging on my door and said he was going to kill me and make her listen. I was totally alone in the apartment with him, sleeping upstairs in my bed. If I hadn't locked my door that night, would I even still be alive? If I had left my car keys downstairs, would I have been able to get away? When I returned to my apartment the next morning, my bedroom door was completely kicked in. My belongings were scattered everywhere, and the large butcher knives were missing from the kitchen, instead sitting in the corner of the hallway to my room. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I was at the gas station and went up to the register to buy gas and some drinks as I was going on a small road trip. I got there and there was a large, balding man with a ginger beard and a name tag that read Guy. I smiled at him and was polite since I work in customer service and try to be nice to everyone. You never know what kind of day someone might be having. Guy smiled at me and asked if we'd met before. I'd never seen him in my life, so I made a joke, saying, "I just have one of those faces," and laughed it off. But a bell started ringing in my head because of his tone. I had a deep, sinking feeling in my gut as he took his time checking me out. Guy kept talking to me, saying I looked great today. And then he guessed my dead name. Something I haven't shared with anyone in years, since I am non-binary and dislike people knowing. I try my best to keep my dead name a secret, plus I was paying with cash, so I couldn't think of how he would know. I smiled more, brushed it off, trying to imply that wasn't my actual name, saying, "No, I go by Royal." He frowned and scratched his beard, and I could have sworn I saw bloody dandruff or something like that fall onto the counter. I took my change and went out to my car, filling it up as quickly as I could. I pulled out my phone with the intent to let others know my location and inform my friends and my mom. Feeling hot breath on my neck and someone's body pressed against my back, I spun around. There was Guy. The most ungodly smell hit my nose as he looked down at me. I'm 56, and my best guess is that he was about 6 feet tall. Guy smiled. Several of his teeth were missing. He said I was rude for talking about him behind my back. I laughed it off and apologized. I quickly went to grab the gas pump from the car. Before I could even reach it, Guy grabbed it from me and did it for me, smirking and saying that I shouldn't bother doing such manly things. He went on to explain that he finally knew where he recognized me from. He said I was a sex slave in a past life, that he was my master, and he knew my frame anywhere. I'm 17, and I have never met this man in my life. I nodded and tried to laugh it off, saying, "Oh, really?" I didn't want to anger him. The man didn't seem to be happy with that. As I tried to go around to get into my car, he opened the passenger door to get in. I was in full panic mode. I started my car and put the pedal to the metal, with both doors swinging open as I drove away. Guy fell to the ground and started to scream and curse. I pulled over after a mile and shut both doors. So, Guy at the gas station, let's not meet again. When I was 18, I spent a lot of time in the Redwood Wilderness. My favorite spot was a set of waterfalls several miles from the nearest parking area. Most visitors just parked in the RV area and swam in the creek right along the gravel road. In the 2 years I hiked those trails, I never saw anyone further than a half mile into the trail anyway. One Saturday, I took my girlfriend to see the waterfalls since she had never seen one in person before. We set off on the trail, and not 15 minutes into the walk, she grabbed my arm, got quiet, and said she felt like she was being watched and had the heebie-jeebies. I assured her everything was safe. The only thing I'd ever had to worry about in that part of the woods were the occasional bear or copperhead. We continued on, but she could never shake the feeling of being watched. I just figured she wasn't used to the wilderness and was having trouble adjusting. A couple of hours later, we finally reached the end of the trail and had a picnic at the bottom of the falls. After we finished eating, she tried to check her cell phone for messages and started to panic when she realized we had no service. I explained to her that there was no cell reception anywhere around for miles, that we were finally alone and could enjoy the peace and solitude, which, of course, made her panic more. We started heading back almost immediately because she was clearly scared, and I couldn't help but smile, thinking it was silly. On the way back, I explained to her how many times I've been out there all alone and never had any problems, but she still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We were about a mile from the falls, on the only trail around, when we heard someone call from behind. I jumped nearly out of my skin and turned to see a man walking toward us. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and a heavy beard, with his hat tipped low. She took a small step behind me. "What can I do for you?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. "You guys left your cell phone back by the falls," he said. I saw a slight grin behind his beard as he looked at my girlfriend. "Oh, thanks for the assist," I said, extending my hand. He shook his head and told me he didn't bring it, and that it was still sitting up there. He suggested we should follow him back up there to get it ourselves. We politely declined and made our way back down the trail as quickly as we could, with him following us on the trail several feet behind. He followed us all the way back to our car, and she showed me her cell phone while I opened her door. I haven't been back to that particular trail since then. When I was 7 years old, my mom and dad got a divorce. This event prompted her to move and pursue her career in a different small town, one that would pay better, as she was now a single parent. During our long 12-hour drive to the new location, we stopped in a little town that had a very hippie vibe, lots of art, little shops, and such. My mom said we were here to meet up with her friend Lily. I guess they went way back to her college days and had recently reconnected after a decade. We ended up going to a Thai restaurant to meet for dinner. A slender, somewhat fragile woman walked in very tall, well over 6 feet. She had big, frizzy, curly brown hair with blonde streaks and pale blue eyes. She was wearing a colorful shawl and feather earrings, and she looked like a walking mosaic tapestry. She walked over to the table, greeted my mom with a big hug, then shook my older brother's hand. Afterward, she came around to my side of the table. I extended my hand, but she just stood there, expressionless, with her mouth partly open and staring at me with a blank gaze. It briefly made me uncomfortable. Then, like a switch was flipped, her face lit up with a huge Cheshire cat smile. She knelt down and hugged me tightly. After catching up with my mom over dinner, we left the restaurant, and my mom told Lily, "You can just follow us." So we got in the car, and my mom explained that Lily would be living with us for a while. Lily followed us for the next several hours, and when we arrived at the new place, we unpacked the essentials. The moving truck would arrive the next morning with the rest of our things. There was already a bunk bed set up for my brother and me, and it was fairly late, around 11:00 p.m. when we finally got there. I took the top bunk, and after my mom said good night, I fell asleep quickly. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. because I noticed the patio deck light was on right beside our room. As I gazed through the blinds, I saw Lily's curly hair. She was sitting on the deck cross-legged, smoking a cigarette. I didn't think much of it and lay back down. Then I noticed the light from the window get partly blocked out. Looking behind me with my head still on the pillow, I saw the unmistakable outline of Lily's shadow facing my window. She stood there for a few minutes. I didn't want to move, so I just pretended to be asleep. After a while, her shadow moved, and I heard the front door close. The patio light turned off shortly after. I repositioned myself, facing the wall, and tried to go back to sleep. But just as I began to drift off, the door to our room opened slowly. I turned my head around. It wasn't my mom, it was Lily, wearing a nightgown. I quickly faced the wall and closed my eyes tightly. She quietly walked to my bunk and started combing the back of my hair with her fingers, her nails slightly scraping my scalp. I kept my eyes squeezed shut and held my breath, trying not to let her know I was awake. I smelled lavender essential oil as she rubbed it into the back of my neck, sometimes pinching the muscle, holding it for a few moments before releasing. It felt strange at first, but after a while it wasn't so bad. I actually ended up falling asleep to it. After the initial confusion, the next morning, my mom was off at work, and Lily was waiting at the table with cereal for my brother and me. She had put chocolate chips in my bowl, but not my brother's. As we made small talk with her, she was giggly and seemed to be trying to make us feel comfortable with the new situation. After breakfast, my brother went to his room to set up his GameCube, and I stayed behind, slowly finishing my cereal. I was always the last to finish eating. As I did, Lily sat there, watching me closely. Once I finished, I thanked her and grabbed my bowl to take it to the sink. She placed her hand on mine and said, "I gave you a neck massage so you wouldn't pee your bed. I know lots of young ones pee the bed when they sleep in unfamiliar places." I looked up at her and said, "I've never peed my bed before, but thank you." She continued to massage my neck for the next few nights. Eventually, I told her that I was comfortable now and didn't need the massages anymore. She sighed but acknowledged it. I started elementary school the following week, which meant earlier bedtimes, around 8:00 p.m. My mom and Lily would stay up much later, drinking wine. I always waited for them to go to bed before I used the bathroom at night, because my mom would scold me if I was up late on school nights. My ritual became sneaking out at around 11:00 p.m. once things got quiet to use the bathroom. This continued for the next few weeks, until Lily started doing the exact same thing at the exact same time every night. Whenever I opened my door to use the bathroom, it just so happened that Lily was also heading down the hallway at the same time. She quickly crossed the hall in front of me. I would just go back to my room and wait for her to pass, eventually resorting to using the back mudroom door to pee outside. This started to annoy me. I tried to sneak to the bathroom as quietly as I could, but one night I got up later than usual, a little groggy. I opened the door, and instantly Lily's door slammed open. She barged out completely naked and quickly walked down the hallway. I was already far down the hallway, so I couldn't turn back. I ducked behind my mom's jade plant, tucked my knees to my chest, and hid my head. Lily passed by me so fast that I felt the wind from her movement push my hair. She stayed in the bathroom for almost an hour. The door cracked open, lights off, in silence. I stayed crouched behind the plant until she finally went back to her room. I brushed it off as an accident, but every night after that, if I made any noise, she would sprint down the hallway naked, just as I was about to go to the bathroom. About 2 months into this, my brother and I were sort of fighting with tree branches outside when he clipped my forehead, causing it to bleed pretty badly. Lily saw this happen, and instead of scolding my brother, she stomp-kicked him in the head with her boot, knocking him onto his back. He ran inside crying. Lily then grabbed me and started cradling me, rocking back and forth, shaking so much that she was vibrating, repeatedly asking, "Are you hurt?" in a shaky voice. My mom found out what happened through my brother and decided that Lily had to leave. On her final day, she made a point to see me one-on-one in the driveway before getting into her car. She knelt down and said, "I hope I can see you in a different life. You remind me so much of my husband." Goodbye, and started crying as she hugged me. I asked my mom who her husband was. My mom told me he was a Marine who had died in Afghanistan a few months before Lily moved in with us. Mom said Lily often said I reminded her of him. My mom hasn't spoken to her since. I've never told my mom about the massages or anything else that happened. I felt it would just cause more drama, especially since Lily was already exiled. Back when I was in college in Texas, my roommates 1F and 2M, and I decided to drive to Denver, Colorado for spring break. To maximize our time in Denver, we decided to take shifts and drive straight through rather than stopping for overnight stays. It was roughly an 18-hour trip. So I'm driving my shift when we reach the Texas Panhandle in the early morning hours. We're out in the middle of nowhere and haven't seen a single car in either direction for ages when we notice headlights behind us. The car comes up behind us quickly, then follows behind for some time. Oddly, it would get real close to us, then back off, then get close again. This pattern continued for several miles. We're in the car, nervously joking about it being a potential deliverance situation set in the Texas flatlands. Suddenly, the headlights are joined by red and blue police lights. It's so dark out there that we hadn't seen the light bar on the hood and didn't realize we were being followed by a cop. I check my speedometer and I'm not speeding, so we're all wondering why we're being pulled over. But I go ahead and pull to the shoulder. A cop wearing a cowboy hat approaches my window. He shines his light in the car, looks us over, then asks me to get out of the car. I hesitate at first, but there are 3 other people in the car, so I'm not feeling particularly unsafe at this point. I grab my wallet, get out, and stand against the driver's door. The cop looks at my license and insurance, then tells me he's going to do a sobriety test. I'm thinking, what the heck? But knowing I haven't had anything to drink, I say okay. The way the cop directed me for the walking in a straight line test had me ending my walk right by his car. When I finished, he reached over to open the back passenger door and then told me to get in. Me what? Why, cop, sit in the car while I look up your license. Now, I had heard that the door locks on the back of a cop car only open from the outside, so I knew that if I got in this car and he closed the door, I wouldn't be able to get out. It was like 3:00 a.m. in the morning, pitch black darkness on a road dozens of miles from any civilization. I am not getting in that car. I'm sorry, sir, but with all respect and for my own safety, I do not want to get in the back of your car. Cop angry. What did you say to me? Me repeating. For my own safety and with all respect, I'm not sitting in the back of your car. Cop angrier. Do you realize I could arrest you right now for not obeying an order from a police officer? Me repeating again. Sir, I'm not meaning to be disrespectful, but I'm not getting in your car. We went back and forth like this for several minutes, with him threatening to arrest me, my friends all to spend the night in jail, etc., and me refusing to get in his car. The cop then leers at me and asks, "What are you afraid of?" Being kidnapped, what the heck? How messed up is that to even ask? I glance toward my car and see my friends piled up at the back window, watching the 2 of us. The guys looking ready to jump out. The cop turns to look at them too. I don't know what went through his mind, but after being completely aggressive with me for what felt like forever, he finally gave me a creepy smile, handed back my license and insurance, tipped his hat, then got in his car and drove off. At this point, I was shaking so badly that my friends had to help me get back in the car. I don't even remember if he gave me a ticket. I was so glad I hadn't cried in front of this creep, but I totally broke down once I was in the back seat. To this day, I think about this creep deciding to terrorize a young college female at 3:00 a.m. in the middle of rural Texas, and often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stood my ground and instead gotten in that cop car. I went to college in Florida, and after graduating, the first thing on my mind was getting out of there. I made plans to move across the country and start a new life. I was 23 at the time, with all the options in the world. Everything was in order. I quit my job, and a friend of mine agreed to take over my lease. I'd been living alone in a townhouse since my previous roommate graduated, so my friend moved into the other bedroom while I was preparing to move out. About a week later, at 10 p.m., the 2 of us were watching TV when there was a knock at the door. My friend went up to answer it and came back with a bag of food from a sandwich delivery place, assuming I'd ordered it. I hadn't. We thought maybe it had been delivered to the wrong address, but it was in my name and address on the receipt. The phone number on the receipt, however, was unfamiliar. I called the number and someone answered, but they never spoke. I could only hear ambient sounds and breathing. I searched the phone number, and it appeared to be through an app. I convinced myself this was some kind of prank or misunderstanding. A few nights later, there was another knock at the door. My friend insisted on answering again, and I heard him telling the delivery person that this was a mistake. She doesn't live here anymore. No one ordered food to this address. The driver responded that they had taken the order themselves over the phone and spoken to a man who simply asked for the specials and ordered the first one. It was the same number on the receipt. I called again, and once more I heard someone listening on the other end. The deliveries kept coming every few nights. My move was delayed for unrelated reasons, and the longer I stayed, the more it began to really scare me. Why would someone do this? One time, I called the number after another delivery, with my friend sitting next to me. The stranger picked up the phone as usual, but this time we heard a faint voice. She definitely still lives there. Then abrupt silence. I didn't recognize the person speaking, but I realized I shouldn't have been calling from my own number. I never called again. My friend tried, but the person on the other end never spoke, aside from that one time. Eventually, most of the deliveries stopped, but someone continued harassing us for months in various ways. That phone number began calling at all hours of the day and night, sometimes 30 calls in a row. They usually called my phone, but sometimes called my friend's phone as well. If we answered, they would immediately hang up and call again. I began getting random friend requests on every social media with messages like, "Don't you remember meeting at the party last night?" when I definitely hadn't left my house in a week. Most disturbingly, someone also started throwing eggs at the townhouse, which suggested the stalker was local and knew where I lived. Maybe he was watching every time a delivery was dropped off. Maybe he was watching other times too. The only thing I ever learned was that he knew I hadn't moved. By this point, I was staying inside as much as possible, but you have to leave the house sometimes. I was terrified until I finally moved and blocked the number. My friend ultimately decided not to take over my lease, but I was always thankful he stayed with me those last couple of months. This was about 8 years ago now, and I still don't have the faintest idea of who it could have been. My former coworkers and a few college friends knew I was moving, but I couldn't think of anyone who would have had a reason to keep track of whether or not I'd moved, and I didn't recognize their voice the one time I heard it. To this day, I refuse to answer unknown phone numbers or unexpected knocks at the door. Even contactless delivery gives me anxiety. I am always half expecting them to show up again. I have a lot of distance from the situation now, so I finally feel comfortable posting about it. When I lived in Denver, Colorado, I was staying in a motel-style, off-campus apartment building. It was mostly students living there, and I was on the first floor. There was a large window right above my bed. There were many signs that a stalker was watching me for months before I fully realized the situation I was in. It started with a few stolen packages here and there, a disposable camera stolen from my car, a random movie poster left in my car that absolutely nobody I knew had ever seen before. And most notably, a man in a bright orange hoodie with his hood up walking back and forth past my living room window about 20 times in one day. I was on the phone with my boyfriend when I first noticed him, and I made a comment about it to him, but I figured I was overreacting. 2 months after I first noticed him, my boyfriend was out of town with his family on a trip, so I was watching his dog for him. I woke up earlier than usual to walk her, around 6 a.m. Afterward, I laid in bed on my phone. At one point, around 6:30 a.m., I looked up from my phone and saw the same man in the same bright orange hoodie standing over my bed, looking at me through the window. We were basically a foot apart, with only the wall and the window between us. I was frozen in shock, and he didn't leave. He continued to stare at me for about 30 seconds before walking away. I immediately hid under my bed and called the police. I put 2 and 2 together and realized that all of these coincidences probably weren't coincidences, and he may have been coming by to watch me sleep every morning and possibly night for months. This was the first time I acknowledged him, and he seemed excited about it. The police told me to close all my blinds and to get a camera. Thanks for the help, LOL. They said this was common in Denver, considering both the high student and homeless populations. However, the man didn't look homeless, and he didn't fit the description of anyone who lived in my building. The police had checked with my building manager, so that meant he was coming from somewhere else specifically just to watch me sleep. I followed their advice and closed all my blinds. However, about 2 hours after the police left, he came back, banged on my window, and tried to open my door, which automatically locked. I was absolutely terrified. I called the police again and left town to stay with my boyfriend and his family for the next few days. When I got back, I never planned to stay at my apartment alone at night, but I figured I could unpack my things since it had been a few days, and he probably noticed I was gone. Within the hour of me being back, he was there again. This time, he held up a camera through the one crack in my blinds and held up a knife behind the camera, slowly walking by and making sure I saw it. I saw it all right. I called the police for the third and final time. They made an official police report, and I moved out of my apartment within the week. I never saw him again, but from time to time, I check my old apartment's reviews on Google because they tried to charge me $1,800 to leave while knowing about the situation, which I thought was insane. Colorado laws protect stalking victims from these fees, though. Anyway, I checked recently, considering what the Idaho killer had been up to, and how much it reminded me of my own situation. I saw a review about a man chasing girls around with a knife, and the building doing nothing about it. It was from a parent, so I reached out to her personally on Facebook. The same man in the bright orange hoodie attacked her daughter in the parking lot at 4:00 a.m. with a knife. He tried to stab her as she was getting in her car, stabbed her car when he failed to do so, and tried to slash her tires as she started to escape. He's still up there too. Always trust your gut. I used to be a process server, and I have a lot of interesting stories from that job. A couple of those stories genuinely scared me. This is one of them. This experience helped confirm that I should always trust my gut. I went to an apartment building to serve someone who lived there. As I approached the building, there was an older man sitting on a bench right by the front door. He had a cane next to him. He seemed friendly and said hello. I greeted him back, and initially my guard was down, so I engaged in some small talk with him. I attempted to open the front door, but it was locked. I explained to the man that I was a process server, trying to deliver papers to someone who lived in the building. He started talking about how he had a daughter my age and wouldn't feel comfortable with being a process server because it wasn't a safe job. He also mentioned that it must be even more dangerous for me because of my size. I'm 52. And at the time, I weighed 110 pounds. Instantly, something felt off. However, I dismissed the feeling, thinking I might be overreacting. After all, this was just an older man with a cane. It seemed almost rude to be cautious of someone like that. I still had a job to do, so I asked if he could let me into the apartment building. He agreed. It seemed to take some effort for him to stand and walk toward the door with his cane, which made me feel like I had been overreacting after all. The man opened the door for me, and I walked into the building. I was about to head up the stairs, but he insisted I take the elevator. The uneasy feeling returned, but for some reason I agreed. I thought taking his suggestion might make him leave me alone. As I moved toward the elevator, he followed me, continuing to make conversation. He asked me about my job and life, and I kept my answers vague. When I got on the elevator, the man stepped in as well. I froze, unsure why he was following me. He stood toward the back wall of the elevator, while I stayed near the door. I avoided making eye contact, but watched him in the reflection on the shiny metal elevator doors. I asked why he had followed me into the elevator, and he replied that he was watching out for me. As he said this, I noticed in the reflection that he was staring at me, his gaze moving slowly from my feet to the top of my head. I felt a wave of claustrophobia and knew I had to get out of that elevator immediately. When the elevator doors opened, I practically jumped out. I told the man he needed to stay there because I wanted to respect the privacy of the person I was serving papers to. I added a polite, "Have a nice day," hoping to end the interaction without further incident. The man just nodded. I walked down the hallway, looking for the apartment number listed on the documents in my hands. As I moved, I felt the sensation of being watched. Too afraid to turn around, I kept walking. Eventually, I rounded a corner and moved further down the hallway. The uneasy feeling disappeared, and I realized it was because a wall now stood between me and whoever's eyes I had felt on my back. I reached the correct apartment and knocked on the door. There was no answer. I knocked again, this time much louder. After waiting about 30 seconds, I gave the door 4 solid knocks and waited patiently. I couldn't hear anything inside. No TV, no pets, no microwave running, just silence. I fully believed the person wasn't home. I accepted defeat, feeling a little annoyed I had gone through all this trouble only to arrive and find no one there. I started walking back the way I came. As I turned the corner of the hallway, my stomach sank. The man was standing there. One hand rested on his cane, the other hovering in front of the elevator button. I kept walking, a flood of uneasy thoughts running through my head. As I approached the elevator, the man asked, "How did it go?" I replied simply, "They weren't home." The man responded, "I've been waiting for you here." Something about the way he said this made me uneasy. I knew I shouldn't get on the elevator with him again. Instead, I quickly walked past him, avoiding eye contact. "Have a nice day." "I'm in a hurry," I said over my shoulder, not waiting for a reply. I headed directly for the staircase, moving faster than before. The moment I reached the stairs, I started running. After descending one flight, I heard a loud shout. "Wait!" I glanced back. The man stood at the top of the staircase, carrying his cane. Then he started running down the stairs after me, without using the cane. He moved much faster than before. Heart pounding, I turned away and ran as fast as I could, jumping down 2 steps at a time. I could hear his heavy footsteps gaining on me. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I almost collided with another resident of the building. I apologized quickly, panic setting in, as I realized the man was probably right behind me. I turned to look. The man was now using his cane to navigate the last few steps. The other resident had a puzzled expression on their face. I muttered, "Have a nice day," before darting out of the building and heading straight to my car. Once inside, I slammed the door, locked it immediately, and started the engine. My hands were shaking as I pulled out of the lot. The exit required me to drive past the front of the apartment building. I glanced over to check for the man. There he was. He had stepped outside and stood in front of the building, leaning on his cane and smiling as I drove by. Then he gave me a slow wave. For some reason, I gave him a tight-lipped smile in return. Even though something obviously unsettling had happened, I still felt compelled to be polite. At least I was safe in my car, driving away. There was no way he could catch up to me now. A few years ago, about 2019, I was riding the bus one night to get home. There was a guy on the bus who appeared a little disheveled and dirty, reeked of alcohol, and was generally acting weird. I was sitting in the back, and he sat near me trying to talk to me. I was polite at first. I ride the bus at night a lot, so an intoxicated homeless guy doesn't bother me. And I have no problem making small talk with a stranger on the bus. Plus, I'm used to there being 1 or 2 sketchy people on this route, considering it's late at night. When he tried to get flirty, I politely told him I wasn't interested, put my headphones back in my ears, and ignored him. He got a little frustrated and even said some vulgar things, but I couldn't really hear him, so it was fine. It's not my first rodeo of being in that kind of situation. And while it's uncomfortable, and there's nothing okay about that sort of behavior, I rarely feel threatened. Most of the time, they are harmless, more bark than bite. I'm a big girl, tall and overweight, and I know basic self-defense. I always have an exit strategy when I don't feel safe. When people get like that on the bus, ignoring them and acting unbothered is usually enough for them to lose interest. I only engage if they get in my face or start harassing other passengers, especially women, kids, seniors, or anyone who appears vulnerable, because I won't tolerate that. Anyway, this random, intoxicated, homeless guy would have been just another one of many I've encountered, if not for what happened next. My stop was coming up, and I was looking forward to getting home. I was exhausted and so ready to get to bed. I pulled the cord to indicate that I wanted off at the next stop. He walked up to the front to talk to the driver, and then laughed loudly. I didn't think much of it, though I was a little worried, thinking, please don't tell me we're getting off at the same stop. As the bus slowed down, I waited at the back door to get off, and my stop, instead of opening the back door, the driver opened the front door, letting the guy off. I asked the driver to open the back door, but he shook his head in the mirror. Annoyed, I walked to the front to get off there, but before I could, he closed the door and started driving. Angrily, I said, "What the hell?" "That's my stop." The driver replied, "Sorry, but I can't in good conscience let you off at the same stop as that guy. Either get off at the next one or wait until we get to a transit station and take a bus going the other way." Still not understanding, I asked why. "Because of what he said to me," he replied. When I asked what he said, the driver just shook his head. "Nothing I would like to repeat ever. I'm so sorry, but trust me." Considering the tone of his voice and the look on his face, as frustrated and anxious as I was to get home, I trusted him and took his word for it. I caught another bus going the other way at the next terminal, and watched the driver radio dispatch for peace officers and transit security to patrol the area and near that stop. They were parked in a lot near the stop while I finally got off. I was extra paranoid and on high alert as I walked a couple of blocks to my apartment that night. Fortunately, there was no further incident. I never saw that guy again, and I'm okay with that. To this day, I wonder what exactly he said to the driver. It bugs me not knowing, but at the same time, maybe it's better that way. Either way, the implications were enough to freak me out. My husband and I moved into a cool downtown loft in 1999 in San Diego's Gaslamp district. We had an underground parking garage that was manned by security after the management team left for the day. My husband worked nights while I attended UCSD. On New Year's Eve 1999, my good friend came to visit and to hit the parties. 2000 baby. I had secured a spot for her in a visitor section and went down to meet her. The security guard on duty was a middle-aged gentleman whose name I have long since forgotten. He was always very nice, but there was something about him that bothered me, and I didn't know why. When I met my friend at the gate, he came to speak to us and asked about our plans. My friend told him we were hitting the town on such an exciting night, etc. I said nothing until we got away from the building. For some reason I said, "Rachel, if anything ever happens to me, tell the police to check that guy out, not Nathan, my husband." She laughed and asked me why, and I told her it was just a feeling I had. She reminded me of this later. You'll see why. A few weeks later, I saw him leaving the unit of my neighbor, who I knew was out of town. I thought it was odd, as he was the parking lot guard. When I mentioned it to another neighbor, she told me that the guards had the master key to the lofts in case of emergency. Okay, my husband works nights. The guard knows this. I get a creepy feeling around him. That's great. We added a chain to the door. It already had a bolt and a regular lock, and that made me feel a little better. Later in the year, we were watching the news when the security guard's face popped up on the local TV. I paid close attention. It turns out he was one of the white supremacist leaders from San Diego and had just been found guilty of some race-related crime. which was sending him away for a long time. I lost it. Why, I am black and my husband is white. I thought back to every time he spoke to us, how conciliatory he was, how much he'd ask how we were doing, how he would ask my husband about his job, all the little, seemingly innocuous questions he put to us, and it scared me to death. He had the key to my home. He had to have been bothered by our relationship, but he never showed it except to my sixth sense. I raced to the management office as soon as they opened the next day. One of my neighbors had beat me there. He was the guy whose unit I saw the guard exiting months before. He was threatening to sue management because he had told them months ago that the guy was a white supremacist and was distributing hate leaflets to his son. He was divorced, and the son stayed with him every other weekend. From the gist of his yelling, I deduced that management advised him that they'd asked, and the guard denied any knowledge of pamphlets. His last words as he was leaving were that he was conferring with a lawyer, since they did nothing at the time. Now this guy was on the news for hate crimes committed. He was obviously a white supremacist, and their lack of intervention had allowed him to influence a minor. I have no idea what happened with him, as he moved soon after. I told them about my concerns, and they said they contracted with the security company, and he passed all background checks at the time of employment. Why he was even working as a security guard, I have no idea. Being young, we just let it go. Although I have forgotten his name, I can still clearly see his face when I think about him. I have tried looking him up on Google, but none of the search information I've used brings up this case. I thought about looking it up at the courthouse. There must be some way. But then I think, what's the point? He's in jail still, I hope. Yesterday, I took my son fishing. He wanted to go to a nearby lake that we haven't visited in quite some time. It's not known to be a great area. For some background, the last time we went, about a year ago, a car drove by and screamed, "Nice rear end." Meanwhile, I stood there with my young son. This kind of behavior is unfortunately expected in the area. It's also known to be a late-night hookup spot, as well as a late-night location for substance deals. Due to the lake's reputation, I had made a deal with my dad that I wouldn't stay there past 4 p.m. without him. On to the story, my 12-year-old son, who looks much younger than he is, and I pulled up to our favorite fishing spot, a small pond on the opposite side of the road from the lake. Almost immediately, an older gentleman approached us, asking if there were fish in the pond. I replied that we had just gotten started, so nothing yet, but that we had caught fish in the pond on plenty of other occasions. He thanked us for the information and returned to his spot on the other side of the road. About 15 minutes later, another younger man approached the older man with a dog. I could see and hear them chatting, but they made no move to involve us in the conversation, which I'm glad for. I just wanted to enjoy a day with my son. Unfortunately, the water in the pond was incredibly low and murky, and I could tell we weren't going to have any luck. I told my son to pack up, and we'd try another spot on the other side of the lake. As we began packing our gear into the trunk, the younger man yelled over, "Sorry if my dog and I ran you off." I told him it was no problem, and we were simply moving to a better fishing spot. He then started telling me how nice it is to see a mom taking her kid fishing. how you don't see that very often, etc. I get this a lot, so I'm pretty used to it. We had a short conversation about it as I packed up. Before I could leave, the younger man started up another conversation, this time asking me how old I thought he was. This felt strange to me, but I'm nice to a fault sometimes, so I answered his question. I told him I'm a horrible judge of age, but maybe 25. He told me he's 38, and I was too kind. I laughed it off, saying something like, I work with teenagers, so they always guess me well above my age just to be mean. He asked where I worked, and I stupidly told him my city. Turns out he lived there too and started going on about how he got a free apartment on such and such street because his baby mama kicked him out of their house. I think he was talking about some kind of government assistance program. Weird flex, but okay, man. At this point, I'm standing by the car door with my hand on the handle, and my son is already in the back seat. This guy couldn't take the hint and started telling me all about his awful baby mama and how women are supposed to be submissive, quiet, and do what they're told. He specifically said, I mean, it's cool that you can bait a hook or whatever, but you're still a woman. Now my alarm bells are blaring. This guy struck up a conversation by commending me for doing a typically dad thing with my kid. Now he's putting me down for the same thing. He's gone from being overly friendly and complimentary to agitated and ranting. I should have been rude and just gotten in the car and left. But I've unfortunately been conditioned, like many women, to be polite even when we're uncomfortable. Instead, I started making comments in the hopes he'd see I'm not some meek, submissive woman who's going to agree with him. After all, I'm a tatted-up chick with an eyebrow piercing and 2 lip piercings. I don't exactly look like a submissive little housewife. I guess I was trying to make him just as uncomfortable as he made me in the hopes he'd leave me alone. After he said women shouldn't be loud or opinionated, I told him, oh, well, you wouldn't like me at all. He tried to backpedal, saying, I mean, it's okay to be loud, I guess, but don't try that with your man, you know. I said, my man doesn't tell me anything. I do what I want. This kind of back and forth went on for a while before he finally shook his head and said, I just don't understand what kind of woman would act like that. I replied, a strong one. As soon as the words left my mouth, the older gentleman yelled from his spot on the bank, yeah, say that again, honey. This distracted the creep long enough for me to hop in the car and lock the doors. I still didn't feel safe, though. Unbeknownst to the creep, only 2 of my car doors actually have functioning locks, but at least they are the 2 on his side. I put the key in the ignition and turned nothing. Of all the times for my car to act up, it chose now. Panic set in as I repeatedly tried to start my car. I could see him out of the corner of my eye. He noticed my car troubles and was trying to get my attention as he took a few steps toward my car. The engine finally roared to life, and I peeled out of there. Only then did I let my composure crumble and have a long talk with my son about what had just happened. To the older gentleman who took notice of my discomfort and provided a distraction, I'd gladly meet with you again any day. To the younger, misogynistic creep, I don't know if I was actually in any danger from you, but my gut said I was. Let's never meet again. Oh, and to my dad, I'll make you a new deal. I'm never going to that lake alone again, regardless of the time of day. F-17 recently quit my job at a fast food chain after working there for almost 10 months. This story is part of the reason why I didn't want to stay much longer. I worked the drive-thru from 5:00 p.m. to 11:00 p.m. almost every weekend. Seeing regulars was not uncommon for me, and I would even memorize most of their orders and fill it out as soon as I heard their voice. Most were very polite and occasionally tipped, but on one particularly busy day, there was an unfamiliar, weary presence. I had just started my shift, so I was running food to the window. I made eye contact with the man at the window in his car and immediately felt uneasy. I brushed it off because we were busy and I had work to do. Later, once my manager set up my cash drawer, I took over drive-through orders, payments, etc. There were lots of orders, so I was not paying special attention to specific voices or menu choices, but one caught my attention. It was a low, hesitant voice asking for a sandwich. I gave the man the total, and he waited in line. He arrived at the window, and it's the man from earlier. I assumed he just forgot to order something. Now, his car was pretty low to the ground, so he had to extend his arm out to hand me his debit card. As he did this, he mumbled something under his breath without breaking eye contact with me. "I'm sorry, what was that?" I questioned. "I said you're looking beautiful today." At this point, I'm super uncomfortable. Not only do I have a boyfriend, but I'm also underage and not at all interested. "Oh, thank you," I said nervously. I handed him the bag of food and quickly shut the window until he drove away. I half-heartedly complained about him to some coworkers, all male, as we usually do with weird customers, but I still had a strange gut feeling. A little while later, when the average wait in our line was about 10 minutes, I heard a familiar voice over the mic asking for a cup of water. It was low but agitated and forceful. I saw his face through his windshield and walked away from the window so my manager would take care of him. This happened a couple more times that day, asking for straws and other free things. At that point, I was sure that he was just trying to look at me. I was so frustrated with him and the rest of my work day that I went to the bathroom and cried. I usually have pretty thick skin when it comes to this stuff, but I was just so over it. The rest of the night went on, and I did not see him again. I thought I'd probably never see him again until my very last shift at the store a few months later. We weren't busy that evening, but it was much later in the day than the first encounter. I did not recognize the voice, but I immediately recognized his face and car. I swallowed my pride and took his payment, trying not to make eye contact. I called my manager, and he said that he would get the food out for me. As suspected, the man was back in the drive-thru not long afterward for a cup of water. This time I knew better. I sent a male coworker to the window to get it for him, since I was busy anyway. Once given the water, the man asked my coworker, "You guys close at 11 now, right?" I was so glad I was getting picked up by my mom that night. I was constantly looking out the windows and making sure he wasn't up there waiting for me. Call me paranoid, but I've listened to enough true crime to be overly cautious. So to the creepy man in the drive-thru with bloodshot eyes, let's not meet again. This happened only 3 weeks ago. I've thought about it often, and I know without a doubt my patient and I were almost preyed upon by a dangerous individual. I'm a counselor who works for my state. I work with people with substance abuse disorder, the mentally ill, and to a lesser degree, those with slight developmental delays. One aspect of my job with the developmentally delayed is similar to that of a social worker. One thing I have to verify is that the participant is able to achieve their personal goals we set for that year, similar to an IEP in public schools. One of my patients wanted to learn to hike to strengthen her coordination. When I called to make my visit, she asked if she could show me she could hike now. I wanted to say, "I believe you, LOL," but she was excited. I packed my hiking shoes, and the next day I made the visit. She and I are actually a similar age, both in our 40s. As we were walking the trail, we got to a point that was much more isolated. We were no longer walking the trail that loops around a neighborhood pond with many people, but we were on a trail that took us through the woods and a cotton field. She and I were walking, even talking, when she suddenly stopped walking. I looked at her, and just as she went to say, "I have a bad feeling," I had an overwhelming feeling myself that someone was watching us. Due to her developmental delays, I felt more concerned for her welfare than my own. It's hard to explain, but I didn't feel fear. I felt a feeling of protecting her. I looked behind us because I heard the sound of leaves crunching, and sure enough, a guy who looked to be in his 30s was suddenly coming out of the woods, and he was slowly creeping up towards us. There was no one else around, so for this guy to magically come out of the woods and creep up, I knew whatever he wanted was nefarious. I told her to continue walking, giving her a head start. I don't know why I even did this, but I just completely turned myself around, stopped, and I looked straight at him. I just stared. I didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. But as soon as we locked eyes, it was as if he realized, no, they know I'm back here, because he froze and stopped walking towards us. I kept staring at him. Then I started to walk back towards my patient, so he understood my eyes were on him. Then, as I walked backward, I looked over to see my patient look back at him, and he disappeared as fast as he came, back into the woods. If he were just wanting to walk this nature trail, why did he stop as soon as I turned around and stared? Why wouldn't he just continue on his walk and pass us? This guy was clearly waiting and watching for a woman or women to go down the isolated trail for him to come out of the woods when he did. It was clear to me that he was hiding and stalking. I will forever be convinced that my patient's bad feeling and my feeling of being watched saved one or both of us from whatever that man had planned. Almost a year ago, I, 24M, was fresh out of college and had moved into a new apartment. My then 3-year-old daughter also lived with us part-time, struggling to make ends meet while taking care of our small family led to working long hours and not spending as much quality time together as I would have liked. One spring night, somehow we were both at home, which was strange enough in itself. My daughter was asleep in her room. It's difficult to paint a picture of the apartment's layout. We were on the couch in the living room, eating junk food and watching TV. The small hallway was behind us. The kids' room on one side, my room on the other, the bathroom at the end in the center, and the laundry room opposite the bathroom. There wasn't much need for a night light in her room, as the street light in the parking lot provided plenty of light. During a commercial break, we saw the light coming from the kids' room reflected on the TV screen. Then suddenly it was gone, and then it came back. We both saw something block that light. I got up to investigate. I hadn't left the couch before some toy in the kids' room started making noise. See, this is what happens every night when you're at work, and you never believe me. It probably just fell. It's nothing, I promise, I said. Why are you yelling? Then 3 toys started chiming out the alphabet, numbers, and animal sounds. Did they all fall too? She asked. I walked into the room to find all the noisy toys in different areas of the room. They hadn't fallen. Maybe they were faulty. Weak batteries can make toys act funky, can't they? I could explain this. We moved to our room to continue the argument. A legitimate argument about ghosts in our apartment. To this day, it's the most ridiculous fight I've ever had. After several minutes of very heated arguing and no more paranormal activity, I might add, she decided to grab some necessities and go to her mom's. This, of course, escalated the fight even more. Do you realize how crazy you're going to sound banging on your mom's door at 2:00 a.m. because our apartment is haunted? Lesson learned. Never call a woman crazy. She began throwing a week's worth of clothes into her bag, then toiletries. The fight continued in the bathroom. She was tossing her shampoo, toothpaste, and other items into the bag. At this point, I had had enough of this ludicrous altercation. There's no such thing as ghosts. I yelled and slammed my hands on the counter. No sooner did my palms touch the laminate countertop than the lights in the bathroom, hallway, laundry room, and her bedroom turned off. Go to your mom's. She grabbed her things, our daughter, and left. I stayed in the apartment by myself for a couple of days, and nothing else happened. She eventually came back without further incident, and we later divorced. I don't think it had anything to do with the ghosts, but who knows? It's only relevant, so I can fast forward a bit. After we had been separated for almost 2 years, we ran into each other and talked. I asked if I could take her and our daughter to lunch one day to catch up. I picked them up from their new place, which was in the same town. On the way out, we drove past our old apartment. The daughter spoke up as we passed the building. "That's our old house," she said. We both half smiled. "Yeah, I didn't like it there," she added. "Why?" I asked, looking in the mirror to gauge her response. "The mean old man in my room." Nearly a year ago, I 24M was with my girlfriend, her brother 23M, and her mother 52F. This story is after a long period of not seeing them due to the pandemic. My girlfriend and I had a great relationship with few rocky periods. I was finally meeting her extended family, and I really just wanted to spend quality time with them. This happened about 5 years ago. A little background first. My dad had trained me in how to keep calm in stressful or life and death situations. I did the same with my kids. My kids were 12 and 13 years old and in the back seat. My elderly mom was right next to me. We had just finished our errands, and I asked if anyone wanted to go to the popular small lake that has a one-way road going around it, about a 1-mile circular path before going home. They all immediately wanted to do so, mostly to see the new duck chicks. There is a maximum speed limit of 20 mph and several places to exit if you don't want to go completely around. The reason for the low speed limit is that a lot of people go there for fishing, walking, or jogging. We got to see the baby ducks and slowed to a stop at times. There weren't other cars behind us yet to admire the tiny chicks. I was halfway around when this huge man in a big truck went racing around the lake going about 50 mph. There was a lot of screaming from people racing to get out of his way. I immediately started to speed up to take an exit off the road. I was almost there when I heard the truck engine. My mom screamed, and the kids were frozen in fear as I looked into the rearview mirror. He was coming up fast on me. He slammed on the brakes and came just inches from hitting the back of my car. Then he started following me aggressively and screaming all sorts of insults at me. I sped up and got out of there, but he kept following me. My mom was freaking out. My kids were terrified, but doing the breathing exercises, I taught them to keep themselves calm. I yelled at my mom to calm down. I threw my cell phone to my oldest son and told him to call 911 and inform the dispatcher that we were headed to the police station and to please have a few officers waiting for us. He did so, occasionally screaming in fear as this man went down a side street, turned back, and tried to ram us off the road. He would get in front of me and slam on the brakes, park to block the road, or attempt to pit maneuver me. I later thanked God that my dad had been in the military and taught me maneuvers to avoid aggressive drivers. I was able to avoid all the things he was doing. The dispatcher heard the terrified screams every time I had to brake hard or swing the car around. I was swearing like crazy. We made it to the police station, where several officers were waiting for us. The guy was so angry that I don't think he realized where we were. He parked right behind me to block me in, got out of his truck, still screaming, and came to my side. He got even angrier when the officers wouldn't let him near me. He swung out and punched one of the officers so hard in the head that he was knocked out. He got tasered and sprayed as he was tackled down. It took several officers to hold him down. When he suddenly went quiet, he suddenly realized just where he was and began struggling again, saying that they couldn't arrest him because he didn't know they were officers. At that moment, I let out a relieved breath once he was in the back seat of a police car. Paramedics came to check us all out. My mom had to be taken to the ER for extremely high blood pressure and suffering from chest pains. My kids and I were taken in as well. The moment they realized that they were safe, the hysterical crying and clinging to me started. I was shaking and felt cold despite the warm temperatures. I was told that I was in shock. After we all came home, except for my mom, who had to stay overnight, the kids were too terrified to sleep in their beds and wanted to sleep with me, but we were all too wired up to sleep. So I made some sleepy time tea and gave them melatonin. I, on the other hand, didn't take anything, and the comforting noises my home usually makes became scary. A few days later, I got a call from one of the arresting officers, who told me that the man had several arrest warrants for similar incidents. He also told me that the guy had every intention of killing me and everyone else in my car simply because he was angry and wanted to release it. So it was a good thing that I called 911 and went to the police station. It would take me a few weeks, before I could fall asleep easily again. I had to put my kids into counseling, and I still have nightmares from it, but it's really rare now. When I was 18, I spent a lot of time in the Pine Valley wilderness. My favorite spot was a set of pools several miles from the nearest parking area. Most visitors just parked in the designated area and played in the creek right along the gravel road. In the year I hiked those trails, I rarely saw anyone further than a half-mile in. One Sunday, I took my brother to see the natural pools since he had never seen them before. We set off on the trail, and not 15 minutes into the walk, he grabbed my arm, got quiet, and said he felt like he was being watched and had a bad feeling. I assured him everything was safe. The only thing I'd ever had to worry about in those woods were the occasional deer or snake. We continued on, but he could never shake the feeling of being watched. I figured he wasn't used to the wilderness and was having trouble adjusting. A couple of hours later, we finally reached the pools at the end of the trail and had a small picnic. After we finished eating, he tried to check his cell phone and started to panic when he realized we had no service. I explained to him that there was no cell reception anywhere around for miles, that we were finally alone and could enjoy the peace and solitude, which, of course, made him panic more. We started heading back almost immediately because he was clearly scared, and I couldn't help but smile, thinking it was silly. On the way back, I explained to him how many times I've been out there all alone and never had any problems, but he still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We were about a mile from the pools, on the only trail around, when we heard someone call from behind. I jumped nearly out of my skin and turned to see a man walking toward us. He had a shotgun slung over his shoulder and a thick beard, with his hat pulled low. My brother took a small step behind me. "What can I do for you?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. "You guys left your cell phone back by the pools," he said. I saw a slight grin behind his beard as he looked at my brother. "Oh, thanks for the assist," I said, extending my hand. He shook his head and told me he didn't bring it, and that it was still sitting up there. He suggested we should follow him back up there to get it ourselves. We politely declined and made our way back down the trail as quickly as we could, with him following us several feet behind. He followed us all the way back to our car, and my brother showed me his cell phone in his pocket while I opened the car door. I haven't been back to that particular trail since then. We lived in an insanely haunted house. I genuinely wouldn't believe in paranormal phenomena if not for living there. I had a 130 lb Akita. He was the alpha male of his litter, and his grandfather was the largest Akita ever shown in the United States. This dog was massive and afraid of absolutely nothing. Not even my dad, who's 67 and 250 pounds, could stop him from doing anything. I was about 12 when we left the house, maybe 11. We moved there while I was in second grade. The house was essentially a massive hallway situated on 5 acres of property on an island off the Pacific Northwest coast. Half of the property was covered in dense woods, super green, with stinging nettles growing over an inch thick and several feet tall. Shortly after we moved in, my mom would occasionally come into my room in the early hours of the morning and asked if I had been running down the hallway. Of course I hadn't. I was asleep. Then I started hearing it too. It sounded like multiple grown adults sprinting down the 100-yard-long hallway. The house also had a massive basement that stretched about 3/4 of its length. My dad, who used to be a producer in Los Angeles, set up a home theater and music equipment down there, along with a ton of video games. So I spent a lot of time there. My parents are your average people. My mom has 2 master's degrees, and my dad has 1. Both are highly intelligent and incredibly skeptical. My dad always tried to find rational explanations for the strange occurrences, like creaking sounds at night. Spending time in the basement, I often got an unsettling feeling, like when you were a kid and immediately sense a place wasn't safe. My giant, fearless dog refused to go down the basement stairs. He literally couldn't be dragged down, not even by my stepdad. We tried making the basement his room, but it didn't work. Strange things happened over time. One night, every piece of electronic equipment in the basement turned on at 4:00 a.m., and the volume was cranked all the way up. The system was massive, and the volume had never been set that high. My parents, initially skeptical, called the security company, but there was no sign of forced entry. All doors were locked, and the system checks showed nothing abnormal. This happened multiple times. The basement also had a small wooden storage closet in the back. I was once asked to retrieve something from it, and flat out refused. That room terrified me. It had cracked concrete walls and handmade wooden shelves. Despite being adventurous and not easily scared, I avoided that room at all costs. Years later, my parents admitted they also found it unnerving. One night, while my parents were in the closet, every box above shoulder level flew off the shelves, striking them hard. The shelves themselves remained intact. My dad had also dug up what he thought was the septic tank, but instead found a massive pile of Native American artifacts, including human bones, which were confirmed as such. My mom researched the local tribes and contacted one that had lived there over 50 years ago. Tribal elders from Alaska visited and confirmed the property was on a burial ground. They strongly advised us to move and sell the house to business, not individuals. They performed a cleansing ceremony, but we moved a year or 2 later. The house is now a muscle therapy clinic. To this day, it remains the creepiest place I've ever been, even after visiting other supposedly haunted locations. Nothing compares to that experience. This happened just a few nights ago. I waited a few more nights before deciding to post, to see if it was some recurring, explainable thing. It hasn't happened since, so I feel it's appropriate to share now. My fiancé and I were going to bed around 10 or 11 p.m. Our bedroom is in the basement, and our roommate lives upstairs. His schedule is the opposite of ours, so we've become accustomed to him knocking on our door late at night if he needs anything. Fiancé and I were having our final conversation before drifting off when we heard a familiar knock at the door. "Come in," I said, because we're all pretty close, and he knows he's welcome. But no one stepped through the door, so I said again, "Come in," still nothing. We called his name, and when he didn't come in, I got up and opened the door. There was no one there. "Huh," I said, and we joked briefly about how it's the ghost. Long story short, we've had some other weird experiences, as people often do with old houses, but nothing as strange as what happened this night. And then we went back to bed. Fiancé fell asleep, and I started to drift off. As I was about to fall asleep, I heard another knock. This didn't wake my fiancé, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I got up and decided to investigate the basement a little. Maybe the cat was being a brat, or something was settling. I noticed that the knocking sounded similar in tempo to the first time, so I wondered if it was some pipes in the walls adjusting to the winter temperatures. I figured it was probably that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the noise was very obviously knocking against our door. We are very used to the sound, since our roommate often approaches us that way. I also know what creaking pipes sound like, and this wasn't that, nor had the pipes ever adjusted that way in previous winters. Well, whatever. It was annoying, but not a big deal. I went back to bed and actually managed to fall asleep this time. About 30 minutes later, the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. It could have been something settling in the house, but it so obviously sounded like knuckles on the wood of our door, the pattern, the tempo, and the hollow sound of the door. And it was happening at our door. It wasn't in the walls or ceiling. We have our laundry room one room away from our bedroom, but our door is so thick that we never hear anything happening out there. It was definitely weird, but I was tired and had to work in the morning, so I tried my best to ignore it. Every 30 minutes to an hour, the knocking came back, and with each occurrence, the knock pattern changed. Deliberate knock, knock. Fast knock, 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 knock. And there was even a shave and a haircut. Each time, I tried to ignore it and fall back asleep, only to be jostled awake again. I had lost track of time, but I assume it was early morning when I was suddenly jolted awake by a knock followed by a male voice saying, "Hey." Okay, so this had to have been our roommate. I got up and once again opened the door to find no one. Maybe he was messing with us. He has a weird sense of humor. I begrudgingly put on some clothes to go walk around upstairs and find him. Turns out he was still at work. The house was pitch black, and I was starting to freak out. I went to the front door to see if someone was knocking there, but there was no one, of course. If someone had been trying to get in all night, the dog would have been freaking out. But I had no other explanation, so I made myself go back to bed. Maybe the pipes weren't just shifting to sound like knocking on wood, but also creaking to sound like a man calling out. The night went on, and though the knocking continued, I finally got used to it and actually managed to get a few hours of sleep. Until around 7:00 a.m., when my fiancé and I leapt out of bed to another obvious "hey" from outside the room. One last time, I opened the door to find no one. I confirmed with her that yes, she woke up because of the "hey," and I explained to her that I had been dealing with the knocking all night. Our roommate didn't come home until later in the day, and I asked him if he had tried to talk to us the previous night. He confirmed that he had never come home and had stayed at a friend's house. I told him what happened, and he was just as stumped as we were. As I mentioned earlier, we waited the following nights to see if there would be any more weird house sounds, even as things have warmed up and cooled down again. There have been no more weird noises to suggest pipes or other old house sounds in general. were fans of paranormal activity stuff, but always err on the side of skepticism. This was probably the weirdest thing to happen to us at this house, and I still don't know what it could have been if not some genuine high strangeness. My mom was born and raised in the high country of east central Montana. She came from ranching people, and her father, my grandfather, was a genuine cowboy. She often worked around the ranch with him, so not much shakes her to her soul, except for what happened when she had to run into town while I was only 8 months old. This happened in the middle of a sunny summer day. The ranch she was raised on was almost 2 hours away from the nearest town. You had to drive north on a highway for 30 minutes, then take a dirt road for another 45 minutes across the Montana high country to get to the ranch. I'm emphasizing this because it shows how far out into the middle of nowhere she lived at the time, and it plays into why this story becomes so disturbing. My mom had to run into town to get groceries and baby supplies for me. She was driving back on the long and isolated dirt road to the ranch when she reached into her purse on the passenger seat to grab something. It slipped out of her hand and fell into the passenger footwell. Fair enough, she stopped the car to safely retrieve what she dropped. As she sat back up, she looked into the rearview mirror and saw a man about 100 feet behind the car, running toward her. Needless to say, she quickly put the car in gear and got the hell out of there. As she checked on me in the car seat to make sure I was okay, she saw the man give up the chase and run back into the ditch to hide. When she got home, she told her parents, my grandparents, about what had happened, and they were stunned. Here's where it gets psychologically disturbing. My mom didn't see any cars or trucks parked along the dirt road the entire way to the ranch. She also didn't see anyone walking on the highway or the road, which raises even more questions. How did he get out there? Why was he out there? And even more disturbing, what would he have done to my mom or to 8-month-old me? The more I thought about it, the more disturbing it became. I've only asked my mom about this story twice. After the second time, she told me never to ask her about it again, and I completely understand why. I get messed up thinking about it, so I can only imagine how she felt having experienced it firsthand. Edit, I just need to address a few things. First, this occurred way out in the middle of nowhere, in the Montana high country. It's wide open, flat grassland with low rolling hills. The only traces of human activity are fence posts, a windmill, or maybe an old abandoned barn or house. I'm emphasizing this because some comments suggested that my mom should have just called the police. To that I say, what police? There are police in the small town where she got her groceries, but out in the Montana high country. Good luck. This is the main reason people who live out there carry firearms. If something happens out there, you might have to deal with it in the moment. I'll leave the connotation of that to you. Second, some comments pointed out that it was an interesting coincidence that my mom stopped her car near where the guy was hiding. Again, coincidences happen, and weird things happen in the middle of nowhere. Who knows why the guy was out there? Rural Montana is not a place where you casually hang out unless you live out there, know someone who does, or have business with someone. You shouldn't be out there for any reason. In addition to not seeing anyone walking on the highway or the dirt road, or vehicles parked along the side, Any person who made it out that far on foot is not someone anyone should be interacting with. My mom was a petite 19-year-old woman with her 8-month-old infant in the back seat when this happened. I highly doubt she could have been of any help to him. We'll never know why he was out there, and frankly, I don't think we ever want to. I lived in the Midwest, on a small rural lot between a cornfield and a small forest in a camper. I've lived in this county my entire life, and I know it like the back of my hand. That being said, I've come to the conclusion that my experiences in the rural and wooded parts of this county are due to crawlers. I'm 100% sure of it. I've had many encounters, none back-to-back, but they happen frequently. There's a forest in the middle of the town that I've always hated at night since I was little. As I got older, my cousin and I thought it would be fun to get scared. So we'd go there at night on purpose, but we never lasted long. I always felt like I was being watched. The urban legends about people going missing there at night only made me feel more uneasy. Fast forward to a few years ago, when I got married and settled into life as a husband. I would take my large, all-black German Shepherd Ripper on walks with me at night. I always walked toward the park, though I usually didn't enter it. The first time something really happened was 5 years ago. I was walking Ripper when the woods in front and to the right of me. The neighborhood edge and a small playground were behind me, and to the left went silent. My dog, who's usually a very stoic and quiet animal, started acting super anxious. He's 120 pounds, built like a tank, and looks very intimidating. He knows it. I heard rustling in the woods following me, and I felt like I was being stalked. I ran home, and that was the end of the first encounter. I had a few more encounters like that, but last year, things really amped up. I was on a walk around 11:30 p.m. with Ripper, my wife, and our new dog, Tucker, a terrier pit bull mix. We were walking down the same path when, about 3 blocks away from the woods, 4 deer sprinted out of the trees into the street, looking terrified. Then I heard what I can only describe as a human trying to mimic the sounds of a monkey. I thought it was silly until I read a similar story from another person who heard the same thing. We laughed it off, assuming it was just some kids playing around. But when we reached the woods and walked parallel to them, we saw 2 reflective eyes and a silhouette staring at us from the tree line. We also heard a deep growl followed by a hissing sound, but it wasn't high-pitched. Both of our dogs acknowledged this as well. Ripper stared, and Tucker growled a little. I made a Facebook post in the community group, and other people shared similar stories from around town. Around this time, I got a job as a tour guide and maintenance worker for Rail Explorers. I'm working there again this year, starting April 1st. Essentially, they take in unused or specific railroad sections that aren't federally regulated, and you can use pedal carts with motor assistance to explore the tracks. It's a super cool and fun job. The rail work is about 5 minutes from where I live and goes through the woods in an inaccessible part of the county. Unless you float down the river and hike up steep wooded hills, you have to go under an old car bridge and over 2 multi-hundred-foot-long old train bridges. The first is larger and taller, standing about 150 feet off the ground above the forest. The second goes over the river. About 6 months into the job, It was fall. We work until midnight sometimes, with the last tour leaving around 9:00 p.m. That meant the last tour for the last 2 months of the year were in complete darkness. The way the job operates is with 6 employees. 4 get on the lead bike and 2 get on the rear bike. From the lead bike, we drop off one person at a busy intersection to flag traffic and another person at the large train bridge over the woods. The person at the bridge gives a short safety speech to customers who stop and go one at a time across the bridge. The employee carts are much faster than the customer carts. We all have walkie-talkies and usually use battery-powered floodlights on stands so customers can see us, and we wear light-up safety vests. One particular night, we were running about 20 minutes behind. Instead of leaving the depot at sunset, we were leaving at dusk. I was stationed at the high bridge. By the time we reached the bridge, it was pitch black except for the stars providing a little light. My coworkers dropped me off and waited with me until the first customer arrived. I gave a brief safety speech and chatted with them a bit. I was trying to buy some time and wait for the next customer cart, so there wouldn't be a huge gap for my coworkers who had to flip the bikes around. After a few minutes, I let the first group go, and I was alone. I was alone for about 20 minutes. I kept using the radio, but there was only static. This was one of the only times we've ever had an issue like that. I kept seeing movement in the tree line, hearing fast footsteps all around me in every direction. I had the flood light above my head so everyone could see me, but I couldn't see anything. I turned off the floodlight and used my personal flashlight. I kept catching glimpses of pale skin moving quickly, but every time I started seeing something, I'd hear the next customer cart coming. So I turned the light back on and waited for them to come around the corner. When they pulled up, I noticed they had a little boy with them who was scared of the dark. I was terrified at this point, but had to act normal, especially for the boy. I didn't want to scare him. As I finished my speech, I heard movement right behind me. I turned around and instinctively said, "Jesus," then spun with my flashlight on. Poor kid. I quickly told them it was probably just a deer, and they were good to go across the bridge. That same night, the person stationed at the intersection. This wasn't like an in-town intersection. It's very rural and right next to a massive cornfield, was Native American and very in tune with his culture. He told me privately a few weeks later that he heard rustling in the cornfield, and whatever was out, there was whispering his name and trying to lure him into the field. He also had no communication for those 20 minutes, but he wasn't in the woods and could see much better than me. Another time, my coworker and I were heading back on the front cart. We were ahead of everyone, so we stopped the cart in the middle of the high bridge. It sounds scary, I know. I'm a bit afraid of heights, and this bridge has massive gaps between the planks you could fit through. But after doing it so often, you get used to it. It was a clear night, and we were watching the stars and having some small talk. Then it went silent. We were 100 feet or so in the air above the woods, and we could hear for miles. The sound of dogs barking across the river 2 miles away could be heard without even seeing the houses. Then we heard what sounded like a human mimicking a monkey noise, followed by growling. My coworker looked at me completely seriously and told me in a stern tone that we needed to get out of there right now. I quickly drove off, and he moved to Nevada shortly after this. A few other strange things happened here and there, and to other coworkers as well. Each of my coworkers has at least one story. A few months later, it was late fall, around the middle of November. I often drive through that park in town when I just want to go for a drive. I had my dog Ripper with me, and it was around 2:00 a.m. I couldn't sleep, so I was listening to a Melvin CD and driving leisurely through the park. As soon as I passed the entrance gates, I felt really uneasy and strange. I'm not easily scared, but going to that park at night fills me with a primal fear. It's beyond fight or flight. I have never felt that way anywhere else in my life ever, and I feel it every time I'm there. I was driving through the park with the windows rolled up, but Ripper could still poke his head out, though he couldn't leap out. As I went deeper into the woods, I started feeling worse and worse. I didn't want to turn around because I was already past the halfway point, and turning around would only make me stay in the woods longer. So I started speeding where there were no turns I couldn't see around. I rounded the last corner, and what I saw made me have nightmares for months. There was a pale, skinny humanoid, tall and lanky, not quite human, crawling on its hands and feet, but it was crawling incredibly fast, like 20 mph fast. We don't have bears here. The only animals that size are large humans and deer, but that definitely wasn't a deer. It crossed the street from my right and went into the tree line. Ripper saw it too. He doesn't bark at animals. He doesn't even bark at other dogs. But he went ballistic, trying to force himself out of the small gap in the window. He was nearly foaming at the mouth and snarling. He never ever acts like that. I'm a certified dog trainer, and I've raised him from birth. Most recently, I've become obsessed with this park. I've walked there at night from my camper with Ripper. I'll never do it again. I didn't see a figure this time, but as I entered the park, a massive owl flew by my head so close I could have swatted at it mid-flight. For some reason, this made me feel uneasy. As soon as I entered the park, I felt extremely weird, anxious, and nauseous. I walked a few hundred yards to the only street light in the entire park and turned around to face the woods. Ripper and I just stood there, frozen, for about 10 minutes. The silence was deafening. Every time I heard anything, I jumped. Ripper was anxious too. He kept staring at a specific spot in the woods, a ways off. I swear I saw eyes there every once in a while. I built up the courage to walk out and haven't gone back since. It'll be interesting to see what happens at my job this year. I also wanted to add that the county I live in is packed full of abandoned mines, hundreds of them. It was April of 2008. I was 20 and living in Denver for a year-long work contract with a nonprofit in Boulder. My girlfriend, now wife, and my best friend Tim drove to Colorado from our home state to visit me for my 21st birthday. The nonprofit I was working for housed their employees in dorm rooms, and drinking was not allowed on site, nor were visitors allowed to stay overnight. So I booked a hotel room in downtown Denver for the weekend, where we could drink in honor of my 21st. The hotel was big, very nice, and in a safe, central area of the city. It was so nice, in fact, that it was the same hotel where most of the politicians would later stay during the DNC convention of 2008 that took place in Denver that summer. My wife and Tim arrived Saturday morning, and we all met up at the hotel. The day was fantastic. We drank across the city most of the day. By about 1:00 a.m., we got back to the hotel. The room was typical, with 2 queen beds. Bed number 1 was close to a big window looking out across the city, and bed number 2 was pushed against the wall with a door that opened to the bathroom. You couldn't see the door or the entryway to our room unless you were at the foot of bed number 1. We drank more and chatted in the room until about 4:00 a.m. My wife was lying at the head of bed number 2, flipping through the TV. Tim and I were seated at the foot of bed number 1, staring out the window as we talked. As we were talking, I heard some movement and the sound of a door opening. Without looking away from the window, I assumed it was my wife getting up to use the bathroom. A few minutes passed, and I thought I heard movement again, so I finally turned around to look. I saw my wife still lounging in bed number 2, just as she had been. "Did you get up a few minutes ago and use the bathroom?" I asked her. "No," she replied. "I thought I heard a door," I said, with her looking confused back at me. "Yeah, I thought I heard that too," Tim said, breaking his own gaze from the window. It was then that I started to feel cold, and I sobered up pretty quickly. Very softly, I heard Tim say, "I think there's someone in our room." I lurched forward from the foot of the bed to look into the pitch-black entryway. I could barely make it out, and I wanted to believe I wasn't seeing it. But there was a man dressed in all black with a black baseball cap pressed into the 90-degree corner of the entryway where the room door and wall met. Absolute silence fell over the room, and it felt like hours passed as I started to panic in a way I never had before. We all knew. We knew we weren't alone and hadn't been for a while, and he knew we spotted him. Eventually, Tim gathered the courage to meekly speak in the direction of the entryway. "Hey man, is there something we can help you with?" Another period of silence, which felt like an eternity, went by. He slumped off the edge of the wall a little into the light and made eye contact with Tim and me. We all just stared at each other. Then eventually he spoke up and said, "Is this room 1709? "No, man, it's not," Tim said, stroking his beard nervously. He stared at us for a while longer, raising his eyebrows and shaking his head. He then turned around and left. We then erupted into a million swear words and paced around the room. I called the front desk. They told me that he was drunk and had been found in the stairwell, but had been directed back to the right room. Minutes later, Tim called the front desk, and they told him that he was not a guest. He had been apprehended in the stairwell and taken into police custody. Then a while later, they told my wife he had disappeared, and they had no idea who he was or what he was doing. They told her there wasn't even a room 1709 in the hotel. We got 3 different stories. We still have no idea what that was all about, or how he managed to get a key card to our room. We were sure the door was closed. It was easily the most terrifying moment of my life. Always use the latch in hotel rooms. We got this day refunded, and about $200 in food credit from the hotel. We should have sued, but we were young and dumb. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.